I was 42 years into this fight. 20 in the Army, 22 more making sure the systems worked so the next generation of soldiers could come home alive. That Tuesday morning, walking through the glass doors of Apex Defense Solutions, I didn't know it would be the day everything changed. The email was waiting in my inbox like a landmine. Mandatory all-hands meeting, operational efficiency review. Brad Kessler's signature at the bottom, that Stanford MBA who'd been brought in 6 months ago to modernize our legacy infrastructure. Translation: cut costs and boost profit margins for the private equity vultures who'd bought us out. I grabbed my coffee, black, no sugar, same as I'd been drinking since boot camp, and headed to Conference Room Alpha. The big one, with the wall-mounted screens and the long mahogany table that had seen 1,000 briefings about keeping America's digital backbone secure. Brad was already there, crisp white shirt, no tie, that calculated Silicon Valley casual look. 34 years old with the confidence of someone who'd never had bullets whizzing past his head. He was clicking through slides on his laptop, probably the same optimization presentation he'd given to a dozen other defense contractors before landing here. "Frank," he flashed that practiced smile. "Glad you could make it." Like I had a choice. I took my usual spot, 3 seats down from the head of the table, close enough to hear everything, far enough back to observe. Old habits from intel briefings in Baghdad. The room filled up slowly. Amanda Price from HR, all nervous energy and forced enthusiasm. Tyler Brooks from analytics, Brad's little protege who treated every conversation like a TED Talk. A handful of other department heads, mostly civilians who joined after the buyout. What struck me was who wasn't there. Colonel Jake Torres, our NSA liaison, always attended these meetings. So did Patricia Wells, our Pentagon interface. But this felt different, smaller, more contained. "All right, let's dive in," Brad said, clicking to his first slide. Q3 performance review and strategic realignment. The buzzwords started flying immediately. Synergies, scalability, optimization. I'd heard it all before, but this time there was an edge to it. Brad was building up to something. "Our security protocols," Brad continued, advancing to a slide filled with red arrows pointing downward, "are consuming 37% of our operational budget. That's unsustainable in today's competitive landscape." I felt my jaw tighten. Those protocols weren't line items on a spreadsheet. They were the difference between encrypted communications reaching our forward operating bases and having them intercepted by hostile actors. I'd helped write half of them after watching good soldiers die because some contractor cut corners on secure networks. "Frank," Brad's voice cut through my thoughts. "As our senior defense systems analyst, I'm sure you have thoughts on streamlining these legacy processes." Legacy processes. The same legacy processes that had kept American forces connected and protected for over 2 decades. I stood up slowly, the way I'd been trained to address superior officers, even though this corporate cowboy had never worn a uniform in his life. "Those protocols exist for a reason," I said, keeping my voice level. "Each one was implemented after a specific security failure that cost lives or compromised operations." Brad's smile never wavered. "I appreciate the historical context, Frank, but we need to think forward, not backward. Our analysis shows we can maintain operational security while reducing redundancies by 40%. Redundancies? The word came out harder than I intended. Those redundancies are what keep communications secure when primary systems fail. When Staff Sergeant Morrison and his unit are calling for medevac support in hostile territory, they're not looking for cost-effective solutions. They're looking for systems that work. My son Tommy's name slipped out before I could stop it. 6 months into his second deployment, running security for convoy operations in a classified location somewhere in the Middle East. The same theater where secure communications could mean the difference between a successful mission and a flag-folded triangle. Brad's expression shifted slightly. Not quite irritation, but something close. "I understand your emotional attachment to these processes, Frank, but emotions can't drive strategic decisions." Emotional attachment. That's what he called 42 years of keeping America's warriors connected and alive. I could feel the room watching us, waiting to see if the old soldier would blow up or back down. "Copy that," I said, using the acknowledgement that meant I'd heard him but didn't agree. "However, these protocols are mandated by DoD 8570 and NIST frameworks. Any modifications require Pentagon approval and congressional oversight." Brad waved a hand dismissively. "We'll handle the compliance paperwork. What I need from your team is a streamlined security matrix that reduces implementation time by 60% and cuts hardware requirements in half." I stayed standing. "In the Army, you didn't sit down until you were dismissed or the conversation was over. This conversation was far from over. Sir, with respect, that's not how defense contracting works. These systems support active combat operations. Any changes to security protocols require field testing, Pentagon review, and, Frank, Brad's tone sharpened. I'm not asking for a dissertation on military bureaucracy. I'm giving you a directive. We have shareholders to answer to, not just the Pentagon. There it was. The admission that profit margins mattered more than the lives of the men and women depending on our systems. I thought about Tommy, somewhere in the desert, trusting that the equipment keeping him connected to base was built by people who understood what failure meant. Understood, I said. I'll need that directive in writing, along with your acknowledgement that these changes may impact operational security for active missions. Brad's smile returned, but it was thinner now. Of course. Amanda, make sure Frank gets the documentation he needs. Amanda Price nodded eagerly, already taking notes. She'd been with the company for 8 years, since before the buyout, but she'd adapted quickly to the new corporate culture. Survival instinct, I supposed. One more thing, Brad continued, clicking to his next slide. We're implementing a new team structure. More collaborative, less hierarchical. The slide showed organizational charts with arrows and boxes, but what I saw was a purge. Half the names in the restructured departments were veterans. Men and women who'd served their country, then brought that same dedication to protecting it as civilians. Now they were being labeled as legacy personnel and shuffled into supporting roles. Jake Torres will be transitioning from his liaison position to a consulting role, Brad announced. Commander Jake Torres had 25 years Navy intelligence, including 3 tours coordinating naval communications security. He'd saved my ass more than once when system failures threatened mission-critical operations. Tyler will be taking over day-to-day coordination with our government partners, Brad continued. Tyler Brooks, 28 years old with an MBA and exactly 0 experience with classified communications. He'd probably never seen a SCIF room, let alone understood why we needed triple redundant encryption for satellite uplinks. What about clearance requirements? I asked. Tyler doesn't have the security credentials for Pentagon liaison work. We're working on expediting his clearance process, Amanda chimed in. The new administration is very supportive of streamlining security protocols. I almost laughed. Security clearances weren't something you expedited. They were earned through years of service, background investigations that went back generations, and the kind of trust that came from proving yourself under fire. Tyler's biggest challenge had been choosing between corporate health plans. In the meantime, Brad continued, we'll be outsourcing some of our server maintenance to reduce overhead costs. I've identified a vendor that can provide the same services at 40% lower cost. My blood went cold. Which vendor? TechFlow Solutions. Very competitive pricing, excellent track record. I knew TechFlow. Decent company for civilian IT support, but they had no experience with military-grade security requirements. No clearances, no understanding of ComSec protocols, no business-touching systems that connected to active combat zones. Sir, those servers handle classified communications routing. Federal regulations require... Frank, Brad interrupted, I appreciate your attention to detail, but we need to trust our procurement process. These decisions have been thoroughly vetted. Vetted by whom? I wanted to ask, but I already knew the answer. Vetted by spreadsheets and profit projections, not by people who understood what happened when secure communications failed in hostile territory. The meeting dragged on for another hour. More charts, more buzzwords, more explanations of how the company was pivoting to a leaner operational model. By the time it ended, I felt like I'd watched a demolition crew tear down a building I'd helped construct brick by brick. Walking back to my office, I passed the wall of photos near the elevator. 22 years of company history. Pictures of ribbon cuttings, contract signings, and award ceremonies. In half of them, I was standing somewhere in the background, the guy who made sure the technology actually worked when the cameras stopped rolling. My office was on the 3rd floor, corner suite with windows facing the Potomac. 22 years of seniority had its privileges, at least until the next optimization review. I closed the door and pulled out my secure phone, the one with the red case that connected directly to DoD networks. The message waiting for me made my stomach drop. Dadcoms have been spotty for the past week. Lost contact with base for 6 hours yesterday during patrol. Everything okay on your end? Tommy's unit was experiencing communication failures. The same systems I'd been fighting to protect were already showing stress fractures under Brad's cost-cutting measures. I sat down heavily in my chair and stared at the message. 6 hours without contact meant 6 hours when my son's unit couldn't call for backup, couldn't coordinate with base, couldn't request medevac if things went sideways. 6 hours when they were effectively operating blind in hostile territory. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brad wanted to cut 40% from our security budget while my son was already paying the price for the corners we'd already cut. I reached for my desk phone to call Jake Torres, then remembered he'd been transitioned to a consulting role. Instead, I pulled up my contact list and found General Patricia Wells at the Pentagon. General Wells had been my commanding officer in Afghanistan back when she was Colonel Wells and I was running communications security for Forward Operating Base Chapman. She'd saved my career twice and my life once. More importantly, she understood that in the defense business, people died when systems failed. The call went through on the second ring. Frank Morrison, her voice came through clear and strong. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. General, we need to talk. Not over regular channels. There was a pause. Patricia Wells hadn't made it to 2 stars by missing subtext. How soon can you be at the Marriott in Crystal City? The one with the secure conference rooms. 30 minutes. Make it 20. And Frank, bring documentation. I spent 15 minutes printing everything I could without triggering security alerts. Brad's reorganization charts, the outsourcing contracts, Tyler Brooks's resume with his notable lack of security clearances. Most importantly, I printed the communication failure reports that had been trickling in from various units over the past month. The Marriott was a short drive from our facility, close enough to the Pentagon that half the guests were either active duty or contractors. I found General Wells in Conference Room C, still in dress blues from some Pentagon function. She was reading through a tablet, but looked up when I entered. You look like hell, Frank. Thank you, ma'am. It's been a long day. She gestured to the chair across from her. Tell me what's happening at Apex. I laid out everything. Brad's cost-cutting measures, the security protocol changes, the outsourcing of classified server maintenance. When I got to Tommy's message about communication failures, her expression hardened. How many units are reporting communication issues? I slid a printed report across the table. 17 in the past month. All in active theaters. All experiencing intermittent connectivity or complete blackouts lasting hours. General Wells studied the report, her jaw tightening with each line. This is unacceptable. These systems are life-critical infrastructure. I know, ma'am, but Brad Kessler sees them as cost centers to be optimized. Brad Kessler, she repeated, making a note on her tablet. Stanford MBA, McKinsey background, 0 defense experience. I've seen his type before. They think warfare is just another business problem to be solved with PowerPoint slides. He's pushing changes that violate DoD 8570 requirements, I said. I've documented everything, but he's ordering me to implement them anyway. General Wells leaned back in her chair. Frank, I need you to understand something. What you're describing isn't just corporate incompetence. If communication failures lead to casualties, and we can prove those failures resulted from willful disregard of security protocols, we're talking about potential criminal liability. The weight of that statement settled between us. I'd been thinking about this as a workplace conflict, but she was right. When you're responsible for systems that keep soldiers alive, cutting corners becomes a matter of life and death. What are my options, General? Officially, you follow your chain of command and trust that cooler heads will prevail. She paused, studying my face. Unofficially, you document everything, and when this situation inevitably turns into a congressional inquiry, you make sure the right people have the right information. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card. Congressman Luther Hayes, House Armed Services Committee. He's been asking questions about defense contractor oversight. Might be worth having a conversation. I pocketed the card. What about the immediate situation? Tommy's unit, the other teams experiencing communication failures? I'll make some calls, see if we can route backup communications through alternative providers. But Frank, that's a temporary fix. The real problem is that you've got civilians making decisions about military operations without understanding the consequences. We talked for another 20 minutes, discussing the technical details of the communication failures and the specific protocols Brad wanted to eliminate. By the time I left, I had a clear picture of what needed to happen. Back at the office, I found an email waiting from Brad. Subject line, Security Protocol Implementation Timeline. The email was corporate speak wrapped around an ultimatum. Brad wanted the new streamlined security protocols implemented within 30 days. No Pentagon review, no field testing, no consideration for the troops currently depending on these systems. Just a hard deadline driven by quarterly profit targets. I read through the attachment twice, documenting each violation of federal defense regulations. Brad's proposed changes would eliminate backup encryption protocols, reduce server redundancy by 60%, and remove the manual override systems that had saved lives when automated systems failed. My phone buzzed. Another message from Tommy. Lost comms again today? 3 hours this time. Jenkins says his unit went dark for 8 hours yesterday. What's going on with the network? I stared at the message, feeling the weight of 42 years of service pressing down on me. Every protocol I'd helped develop, every security measure I'd implemented, every redundancy I'd insisted on, it all came down to this moment. My son and his brothers in arms were counting on systems that Brad Kessler wanted to gut for profit margins. I opened a new document and started typing. Not a response to Brad's email, but something else entirely. A detailed report documenting every security protocol violation, every communication failure, every decision that prioritized profit over the lives of American service members. By midnight, I had 47 pages of documentation, technical specifications, timeline correlations, and witness statements from other veterans in the company who'd watched the situation deteriorate. Most importantly, I had the communication failure reports that directly linked Brad's cost-cutting measures to operational problems in active combat zones. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Congressman Hayes' office, requesting a meeting to discuss urgent defense contractor oversight issues. The second was to Colonel Rex Sullivan at the Defense Intelligence Agency, who'd worked with our systems for the past 5 years. The third was to Jake Torres, now officially a consultant but still connected enough to confirm what I already suspected. Frank, Jake's voice was tight with concern. I've been getting calls from unit commanders all week. Communication failures are becoming a pattern. How bad is it? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be worse than I'd feared. Bad enough that I've got 3 different battalion commanders asking if we have backup communication providers. Frank, these aren't minor glitches. We're talking about complete communication blackouts during active operations. I could hear the frustration in his voice. Jake had spent 25 years in naval intelligence, coordinating some of the most sensitive operations in the Pacific Theater. He understood better than most what happened when communications failed at the wrong moment. What's the official position from the Pentagon? Officially, we're monitoring the situation and working with contractors to resolve technical issues. Unofficially, General Wells has been asking very pointed questions about Apex's recent operational changes. That afternoon, I got the call I'd been expecting. Brad's assistant asking me to come to his office for an urgent discussion about project timelines. I grabbed my documentation folder and headed upstairs. Brad's office was on the executive floor, all glass and steel with a view of the Capitol dome. He was standing behind his desk when I entered, arms crossed, no longer bothering with the fake corporate smile. Frank, we need to talk about your responsiveness to directives. I stayed standing. Military bearing, even in civilian clothes. What directive would that be, sir? The security protocol implementation I sent yesterday. Your team was supposed to begin rollout this morning. That's correct. My team refused to implement protocols that violate federal defense regulations without written authorization from the Pentagon. Brad's eyes narrowed. Frank, I'm starting to question whether you're the right fit for this organization. Your resistance to change is becoming a liability. My resistance is to changes that compromise operational security for active combat units, including the unit my son is serving with. Your personal circumstances can't drive business decisions, he said, echoing his comment from the meeting. Maybe it's time to consider whether someone with less emotional investment should be handling these responsibilities. There it was, the threat I'd been expecting. Step aside and let him endanger my son and every other service member, or face the consequences of standing up to the corporate machine. Sir, I said, keeping my voice level, I've been protecting these systems for 22 years. I've seen what happens when we cut corners on security protocols. Good soldiers die when communications fail. Frank, that's exactly the kind of outdated thinking that's holding this company back. Modern warfare is digital, automated, resilient. We don't need the paranoid redundancies of previous generations. Paranoid redundancies. I thought about the convoy ambush outside Fallujah in 2006 when primary communications went down and the backup satellite link was the only thing that got air support to my unit before we were overrun. I thought about the cyber attack on our Asian operations in 2018 when the redundant encryption protocols Brad wanted to eliminate were the only thing that prevented classified battle plans from being compromised. Those paranoid redundancies saved my life more than once, I said. They're saving lives right now. Brad walked around his desk, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne. Frank, I'm going to be very clear with you. Either you implement these protocols by the end of the week, or I'll find someone who will. Someone who understands that this is a business, not a charity for washed-up soldiers. Washed-up soldiers. 42 years of service, and that's how he saw me. How he saw all of us. Jake Torres, Patricia Wells, every veteran who dedicated their lives to keeping America safe. I understand your position, sir, I said. I'll need that directive in writing, along with your written acknowledgement that these changes may impact operational security for active missions. Fine. He turned back to his computer. You'll have it within the hour. I walked out of his office knowing that the war had begun. Not the corporate power struggle I'd been trying to avoid, but something bigger. A fight for the soul of an industry that had forgotten its mission somewhere between quarterly earnings calls and shareholder meetings. The elevator ride to my office gave me time to think. Brad had made his choice, profit over people, corporate efficiency over operational security. Now I had to make mine. Back in my office, I pulled out the business card General Wells had given me and dialed Congressman Hayes' direct line. His aide put me through immediately. Mr. Morrison. Hayes' voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years asking hard questions on Capitol Hill. General Wells mentioned you might be calling. I understand you have concerns about defense contractor oversight. Congressman, I have documentation of security protocol violations that are directly impacting active combat operations. Service members are losing communication support because of cost-cutting measures that violate federal defense regulations. There was a pause. How soon can you be in Washington? I can be there this afternoon. My office, 3 p.m. Bring everything. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from Congressman Hayes in his heart-building office, surrounded by American flags and photos of him visiting troops overseas. He was reading through my documentation with the focused intensity of someone who understood that paperwork could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers in the field. This is damning, he said, setting down the communication failure reports. You're telling me that Apex Defense Solutions is implementing cost-cutting measures that directly violate DoD security requirements? Yes, sir. And when I raised these concerns, I was told to implement the changes or face termination. Hayes leaned back in his chair. Mr. Morrison, what you're describing constitutes potential criminal negligence in the provision of defense services. If these communication failures contribute to casualties, the people responsible could face federal prosecution. He picked up his phone and dialed an extension. Mary, get me General Patterson at the Inspector General's office. Tell him it's urgent. While he made the call, I thought about Brad Kessler, probably sitting in his glass office, calculating quarterly profit margins while service members went dark in hostile territory. He'd called me a washed-up soldier, but he was about to learn what 42 years of service connections could accomplish when properly motivated. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the time I left, Congressman Hayes had initiated a formal inquiry into defense contractor oversight, and the Pentagon Inspector General had opened an investigation into Apex's operational security practices. The next morning brought chaos. I arrived at the office to find 3 black SUVs in the visitor parking lot and men in dark suits checking credentials at the security desk. The Pentagon Inspector General's investigation had moved faster than I had expected. My phone was ringing before I reached my office. Jake Torres, calling from his home office. Frank, what the hell did you do? I've got DoD investigators calling me about Apex's security protocols. I did what we should have done weeks ago, I said. I reported the violations through proper channels. Jesus, Frank, you know what this means? Full audit. Congressional hearings, the works. Brad's going to go nuclear. He was right. But I'd spent too many sleepless nights thinking about Tommy's unit losing communications in hostile territory, while Brad Kessler optimized profit margins. Some fights were worth having, regardless of the personal cost. The email arrived at 10:47 a.m. Subject line, administrative leave, pending investigation. Amanda Price wanted to see me in her office immediately. I grabbed my documentation folder and headed upstairs, passing investigators interviewing other employees in conference rooms. The corporate machine that had seemed so confident yesterday now looked like a ship taking on water. Amanda's office felt smaller with the weight of impending litigation hanging over everything. She was flanked by 2 men I didn't recognize, probably lawyers brought in to manage the crisis. Frank, she began, her usual enthusiasm replaced by nervous tension. We're placing you on administrative leave pending the completion of the federal investigation. Am I being terminated? One of the lawyers leaned forward. Mr. Morrison, we understand you've made certain allegations regarding company policies. While we respect your right to express concerns, the nature of these allegations requires us to conduct our own internal review. Internal review, corporate speak for damage control and ass covering. They were going to blame everything on a disgruntled employee with outdated ideas about security protocols. I assume this administrative leave is with pay? I asked. Of course, Amanda said quickly. This is purely precautionary while we address the regulatory questions that have been raised. I nodded and stood up. I'll need that in writing, along with confirmation that my security clearances remain active. Walking out of Apex that afternoon felt surreal. 22 years of building relationships, perfecting systems, and protecting communications networks, and it ended with a cardboard box of personal items and an escort to the parking garage. But unlike most corporate purges, this one came with the satisfaction of knowing I'd lit a fuse that would burn through every corner of Brad Kessler's cost-cutting empire. My phone rang as I loaded the box into my truck. General Wells, Frank, I heard about the administrative leave. How are you holding up? Better than expected, General. How's the investigation proceeding? Faster than anyone anticipated. The Inspector General's office found your documentation very compelling. They've expanded the investigation to include 3 other defense contractors with similar operational changes. That was bigger than I'd hoped. If the investigation uncovered a pattern of cost-cutting that compromised military communications across multiple companies, it would trigger congressional hearings and potential criminal charges. Any word on immediate operational fixes? Already happening. Emergency protocols are being implemented to reroute communications through secure backup providers. Your son's unit should have stable connectivity within 48 hours. Relief washed over me. Whatever happened to my career, Tommy and his brothers would have the communication support they needed to complete their mission and come home alive. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of depositions, congressional testimony, and media interviews. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Defense contractor investigation reveals security violations endangering troops. By Wednesday, it was front-page news in the Washington Post and the lead story on every military news network. Brad Kessler's name appeared in every article, along with quotes from his corporate efficiency presentations and memos dismissing security protocols as legacy paranoia. The man who'd called me a washed-up soldier was now the public face of corporate negligence in the defense industry. The congressional hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. I arrived early, wearing my dress uniform for the first time in over 20 years. The hearing room was packed with reporters, congressional staff, and families of service members who'd been affected by communication failures. Congressman Hayes called the hearing to order at 10 a.m. sharp. The witness table held 3 people: myself, Brad Kessler looking pale in an expensive suit, and General Patricia Wells representing the Pentagon's position. The contrast was stark. 2 career military professionals flanking a corporate executive who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. Mr. Morrison, Congressman Hayes began, you've spent 42 years in military and defense service. In your expert opinion, do the operational changes implemented by Apex Defense Solutions compromise the safety of American service members? I leaned into the microphone. Congressman, the protocols that Mr. Kessler eliminated were developed after specific security failures that cost lives. Removing backup encryption, reducing server redundancy, and outsourcing maintenance of classified systems to uncleared vendors creates vulnerabilities that hostile actors can exploit. Can you provide specific examples of how these changes have impacted active operations? I opened my folder and read from the communication failure reports. Unit by unit, date by date, I documented how Brad's cost-cutting measures had left American forces operating blind in hostile territory. When I mentioned Tommy's unit losing communications for 8 hours during a convoy operation, several congressmen leaned forward with visible concern. Mr. Kessler, Congressman Hayes turned to Brad. How do you respond to these allegations? Brad adjusted his tie nervously. Congressman, Apex Defense Solutions remains committed to providing reliable communication support to our military partners. The operational changes we implemented were designed to modernize legacy systems while maintaining security standards. Legacy systems, I repeated, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. Congressman, those legacy systems have kept American forces connected and alive for over 2 decades. Mr. Kessler called them paranoid redundancies, but redundancy is what saves lives when primary systems fail under fire. The hearing continued for 3 hours. Brad's testimony grew increasingly defensive as congressmen questioned his qualifications to make decisions about military communications. When Congressman Martinez asked about his military service record, Brad's admission that he'd never served drew audible murmurs from the gallery. General Wells delivered the killing blow during her testimony. She presented Pentagon analysis showing that communication failures at defense contractors had increased by 340% since corporate efficiency initiatives began prioritizing cost reduction over operational security. The protocols that Mr. Kessler eliminated, she testified, are not suggestions or legacy preferences. They are federal requirements developed in response to battlefield failures that resulted in American casualties. Removing them without Pentagon approval violates both the letter and spirit of our defense contracting standards. When asked about Brad's qualifications to override military security protocols, her response was devastating. Congressman, you wouldn't ask a corporate consultant to perform brain surgery. Military communications security requires specific expertise that comes from years of service and operational experience. Mr. Kessler lacks both. The hearing ended with Congressman Hayes announcing expanded investigations into defense contractor practices and new legislation requiring military experience for senior positions overseeing critical defense systems. I walked out of the Capitol building to find Jake Torres waiting by the steps, grinning like we'd just won the lottery. Frank, you magnificent bastard. Did you see Kessler's face when General Wells destroyed his credibility? Just glad the truth came out, I said. Though I couldn't deny the satisfaction of watching Brad's corporate arrogance crumble under congressional scrutiny. Truth, hell, you just changed the entire defense contracting industry. Every company is going to think twice before putting MBA bean counters in charge of military systems. My phone buzzed with a message from Tommy. Dad, communications have been rock solid for the past 2 weeks. Whatever you did, thanks. Coming home next month. 6 weeks later, I was sitting in the same Marriott conference room where this had all started, across from General Wells and 2 men in expensive suits. The older one introduced himself as Richard Sterling, chairman of the board at Apex Defense Solutions. Mr. Morrison, Sterling began, we'd like to offer you a position as Chief Security Officer, reporting directly to the board, with full authority over all security protocols and military liaison activities. The salary figure he mentioned was double what I'd been making as a senior defense systems analyst. More importantly, the position came with veto power over any operational changes that could impact military communications security. What happened to Brad Kessler? I asked. The younger suit, who'd introduced himself as the company's general counsel, answered. Mr. Kessler's employment was terminated following the congressional investigation. He's also facing potential federal charges related to willful violation of defense security protocols. Sterling leaned forward. Frank, we need someone who understands that this company's mission isn't just about profit margins. It's about keeping American service members connected and alive. The board wants you to rebuild our security culture from the ground up. I looked at General Wells, who nodded almost imperceptibly. What about the other veterans who were pushed aside during the restructuring? Jake Torres will be reinstated as Senior Liaison Officer, Sterling said. We're also implementing a veteran preference policy for all positions involving military systems oversight. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brad had tried to purge veteran influence from the company, and his failure had resulted in veterans taking control of the entire security operation. I accept, I said, but I have conditions. Name them. Every security protocol change gets Pentagon review before implementation. No exceptions, no emergency overrides. Second, any cost-cutting measure that impacts operational security requires board approval and my sign-off. Third, mandatory military systems training for all senior management. Sterling smiled. Agreed. When can you start? Monday. Walking back into Apex Defense Solutions the following week felt like returning to a battlefield where my side had won. The corporate efficiency posters were gone, replaced by photos of the military units our systems supported. The open concept workspace that Brad had favored was being converted back to secure offices with proper SCIF certification. My new office was on the executive floor, corner suite with a view of the Pentagon. The nameplate on the door read Frank Morrison, Chief Security Officer. But the detail that satisfied me most was the photo on my desk. Tommy in full combat gear giving a thumbs up next to a communications array that I'd helped design. 6 months into my new role, Apex had become the gold standard for defense contractor security practices. Congressional legislation now required military experience for senior positions overseeing critical defense systems, a provision that industry insiders had started calling the Morrison Rule. The real satisfaction came from the operational metrics. Communication failures in active theaters had dropped by 87% since we'd restored proper security protocols. No longer were American service members going dark for hours at a time because some MBA had decided that backup systems were redundant expenses. Tommy came home in December, 2 weeks before Christmas. I picked him up at Reagan National, watching him walk through the terminal in dress uniform, looking older and more confident than when he'd deployed 8 months earlier. "Dad," he said, dropping his duffel bag to give me a bear hug, "the guys in my unit have been calling you a legend. Word is you took down an entire corporate empire to fix our communications." "I just did my job," I said, though I couldn't hide my pride. "How were the systems during your last few months?" "Rock solid. No failures, no blackouts, no worrying about losing contact with base during operations. Made all the difference in the world." That evening, sitting on my back deck with a beer and watching Tommy tell his mother about his deployment, I thought about Brad Kessler. According to Jake Torres, he was working for a civilian IT company in California, handling routine network maintenance for office buildings. No security clearance, no military contracts, no ability to endanger American service members with his cost-cutting obsession. The washed-up soldier had outlasted the corporate hotshot. My phone buzzed with a message from General Wells. "Frank, just wanted you to know that the Pentagon is recommending Apex for the new Pacific Theater Communications contract. $4.2 billion over 5 years. Your security protocols were specifically cited as the deciding factor." I smiled and typed back, "Roger that, General. We'll keep them connected." The next morning brought news that would complete the circle. Amanda Price was stepping down as Chief People Officer, citing personal reasons that everyone understood meant she was jumping ship before the next round of federal investigations into defense contractor practices. Tyler Brooks lasted another month before quietly resigning to pursue opportunities in the private sector. Translation: no defense contractor would touch him after his name appeared in congressional testimony as someone who'd supported eliminating security protocols without understanding their purpose. The company Christmas party was different that year. Instead of corporate buzzword presentations about synergy and optimization, we had General Wells as the keynote speaker, talking about the critical importance of reliable communications in modern warfare. The applause when she mentioned my role in restoring operational security was genuine, from people who understood that their work had life and death consequences. Standing at the podium for my own remarks, I looked out at an audience that was 60% veterans compared to the 25% it had been under Brad's diversity and inclusion initiative that had really been about pushing out experienced military personnel. "A year ago," I said, "someone told me I was a washed-up soldier with outdated ideas about security protocols, that my emotional attachment to these systems was holding the company back." The room was dead silent. But here's what that person didn't understand. When you've served 42 years protecting American forces, when your son is carrying a rifle in hostile territory, when you've seen good soldiers die because someone cut corners on communications security, it's not emotional attachment. It's professional responsibility. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Later that evening, I found a package on my desk. No return address, just my name written in block letters. Inside was a small American flag and a note. "Thank you for keeping us connected. The 82nd Airborne Communications Team." I thought about framing it, then decided to keep it in my desk drawer instead. A reminder that this job wasn't about corporate titles or corner offices or executive parking spaces. It was about making sure that when Staff Sergeant Morrison and his brothers called for backup, someone answered. Brad Kessler had called me a washed-up soldier, but soldiers don't wash up. They dig in, they adapt, and they complete the mission. Always. The protocol keeper was back on duty.